Transformations happening across Africa. Today, we are diving deep into the waters of progress, sustainability, and food security in Burkina Faso, where President Captain Ibrahim Traore is once again proving that Africa has the power to feed itself and revolutionize its economy. Burkina Faso has taken a giant leap forward in fish production with the fisheries for employment.
Ladies and gentlemen, the question on every lip today is simple, but the answer will shake you. Why? Why did Captain Ibrahim Traore, the defiant leader of Burkina Faso, release millions, yes, millions, of animals into the nation's newly built artificial river? Was it a festival? A bizarre experiment? A symbol? Or was it something far more daring, far more revolutionary than anyone could have imagined? At sunrise, the world watched in disbelief. Herds stretching beyond the horizon poured into the sparkling man-made waters. Some called it madness. Others whispered of an ancient prophecy. And somewhere between the rumor and the reality lies a truth that could rewrite how Africa feeds itself, defends itself, and even negotiates with the world's superpowers. This was not chaos. This was not a stunt. This was a calculated act of leadership, an act born from secrets discussed in locked rooms, from strategies that reach back to the wisdom of our ancestors, and from a vision that stretches decades into Africa's future. What you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about food, survival, power, and freedom. Because, make no mistake, these animals are not simply grazing in a river. They are marching in a plan designed to break the chains of foreign dependency, to outsmart the quiet war being waged against African food security, and to turn Burkina Faso into a fortress of self-reliance. And if what our sources have uncovered is true, this move is just the beginning. In the next few moments, you will learn the shocking reason behind this unprecedented event. A reason that ties together climate change, economic warfare, ancestral farming traditions, and a silent message to the world powers who still believe Africa can be bent to their will. Stay with us, because once you hear Captain Ibrahim Traore's real reason, you will never look at rivers, animals, or Africa's fight for freedom the same way again. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. What you are about to hear is not an ordinary news report. It is the kind of story that, once told, will linger in your mind long after the cameras stop rolling. It is a story that begins not with political declarations or economic deals, but with a river that, until recently, did not exist. A river carved not by the hand of nature, but by the vision of one man, Captain Ibrahim Traore. And now, this artificial river, stretching for miles through the heart of Burkina Faso, has become the stage for an act so bold, so unexpected, that it has left the world asking, why? In the early hours of last Monday morning, before the sun had risen and while the mist still curled like soft smoke above the water's surface, trucks began to arrive in quiet procession. They came not in twos or threes, but in dozens. The rumble of engines was muffled, as though the drivers had been told this was not a moment for noise, but for something almost ceremonial. The trucks parked at intervals along the winding course of the artificial river. And then, with the kind of precision one expects from a military operation, their rear gates swung open. From inside poured life. At first, only a few splashes broke the mirror-still surface of the water. Then the splashes multiplied, echoing across the valley in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Fish of every size and color darted into the depths, some flashing silver under the pale dawn light. Great netted cages were lowered from the trucks, releasing turtles that blinked slowly before gliding into the shallows. Birds, cranes, herons, and flocks of smaller waterfowl were carefully carried in crates and released into the air, their wings beating in joyous confusion before settling along the riverbanks. But it did not stop there. In came the larger animals. Antelopes and gazelles led by handlers in protective gear, their hooves sinking into the moist soil for the first time. They were guided toward the greener patches where fresh reeds and river grasses had been planted. Even crocodiles, sedated for safe transport, were lowered into the deeper pools, watched closely by teams of wildlife experts. It was not a few hundred animals, nor even a few thousand. By the time the operation concluded, millions of creatures, from the smallest fry to the grandest mammals, had been introduced into the artificial river and its surrounding habitat. Why? That was the question that rippled through villages, cities, and foreign capitals alike. Why had Captain Ibrahim Traore, a man known more for his fierce stance on African sovereignty and anti-colonial politics, orchestrated one of the largest wildlife releases in modern African history? Why pour such immense resources, manpower, and planning into what many outsiders quickly dismissed as a grand environmental gesture? And why now? For days, speculation was all the public had to work with. Some claimed it was a symbolic act, a way to show the world that Burkina Faso was capable of creating life rather than merely surviving drought. Others whispered of a deeper strategic motive, that this river and its creatures were part of a larger plan to secure water sovereignty and food independence in a time of global instability. Foreign commentators, ever eager to interpret African actions through their own narrow lenses, suggested it was nothing more than a political stunt meant to distract from other reforms. But the truth, when it emerged, was far more profound. Captain Traore broke his silence 3 days later, standing before the artificial river itself, with the wind ruffling the military beret on his head. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of history. He said, "We are not just planting animals into water. We are planting the future of Africa into its own hands." And with that, the deeper story began to unfold. This artificial river, it turned out, was not conceived merely as a reservoir or a tourist attraction. It was part of a sprawling ecological restoration and food security project, one that had been kept largely secret until the release of the animals. Traore revealed that in the last 5 years, African nations had lost millions of hectares of fertile land to desertification, worsened by climate change and reckless foreign-owned mining operations. The rivers that once sustained entire communities had either dried up or been poisoned. Fishing stocks had plummeted. Local farmers were abandoning their villages for crowded cities, their children growing up disconnected from the land that had sustained generations. The artificial river was a direct counterstrike. Designed by Burkinabe engineers in partnership with ecologists from across West Africa, it was a lifeline, both literal and symbolic. Its winding course linked villages that had been cut off from each other by years of drought. Solar-powered pumping stations fed it with water collected during the rainy season, stored in vast underground reservoirs. Its banks were lined with native plants to prevent erosion, and hidden underwater structures provided breeding grounds for fish and safe nesting areas for turtles. The release of millions of animals was not just about beauty. It was about reviving a living ecosystem capable of feeding people, sustaining biodiversity, and resisting the creeping desert. But Traore's vision went beyond survival. He understood that food sovereignty was not simply about growing crops or catching fish. It was about independence. For too long, African nations had been forced to import food from the very countries that had stripped their lands bare. For too long, foreign corporations had dictated the terms of what Africans could eat, how it was grown, and at what price. The artificial river was a declaration. Burkina Faso would not be held hostage by food markets in Paris, London, or New York. And then came the most startling revelation. Hidden within the operation was a network of local cooperatives, each one trained to manage a stretch of the river. These cooperatives were made up of farmers, fishers, and young people who had once been unemployed or tempted by dangerous migration routes. Now, they were stakeholders in a self-sustaining system. The fish released into the river were chosen for their ability to breed quickly and thrive in local conditions. The larger mammals were part of a plan to reintroduce sustainable hunting and tourism models controlled entirely by local communities, with no foreign ownership allowed. Even the crocodiles had a purpose. Their presence would keep the ecosystem balanced, preventing overpopulation of certain species. And here is where the brilliance of the plan revealed itself. This was not just an environmental project, but an economic revolution disguised as a river. Every aspect of it was designed to keep wealth circulating within Burkina Faso's borders. Fish would feed the people, surplus catches could be dried and sold to neighboring regions. The vegetation along the banks would provide raw materials for crafts, medicine, and livestock feed. The tourism generated by the thriving wildlife would bring revenue directly into village hands, bypassing corrupt intermediaries. Traore's words that day were clear and fierce. They told me Africa could not feed itself. They told me our rivers were dead. They told me our people must always depend on the kindness of strangers. Today, I tell them, we need no one's kindness, only our own courage. What began as a mysterious release of animals had revealed itself to be something far greater, a quiet revolution in the making. By restoring one river, Traore had challenged the narrative that Africa was doomed to dependence. By releasing millions of creatures into its waters, he had declared that life, African life, could flourish on African terms. And perhaps that is why this story has captured such global attention. Because deep down, it is not just about a river or the animals that now call it home. It is about the refusal to accept that our destiny must be written by others. It is about taking what is broken, a land, a people, a future, and daring to make it whole again. So when the question is asked, why did Captain Ibrahim Traore release millions of animals into the artificial river? The answer is both simple and profound. Because he could. Because he saw a future worth fighting for. Because he understood that sometimes, to change the course of a nation, you must first change the course of its rivers. And tonight, as the sun sets over the calm waters and the call of birds echoes through the valley, one cannot help but feel that something has shifted. Not just in Burkina Faso, but in the very soul of Africa.